is some heavy duty reading that we did today. And so I want to start by just giving a little bit of an overview of what Jonathan Sacks is trying to accomplish here. So as I'm sure Rabbi Sarada said at the first meeting, one of the things that Rabbi Sacks is trying to do is try to understand the role of science and the role of faith in Judaism. And one of his contentions is that really since the 17th century, the two domains of science and religion have been seen as increasingly separate, that science is or not just separate, but contradictory, really, and that really accelerated under Darwin. And you see some of that today. You see the idea that religion is a superstition and that religion is the opiate of the masses, what Karl Marx calls it, that religion is for feeble mind. It's about believing outrageous things like, a virgin birth or Abraham and Sarah having children in their 90s, that religion is often caricatured as something that's about fantasy, whereas science is about truth with a capital T. And that has really, and by the way, that started in the 17th century, but it really took off with Darwin, as I said earlier, and really has grown tremendously over the past 20 years. I mean, you think of this happened about, 7-8 years ago. There was a whole bunch of books. One was by Christopher Hitchens called God Is Not Great. Then there was another, I think, by Richard Dawkins, who is a very renowned scientist, also a pedophile, but be that as it may, a renowned scientist called The God Delusion. There's this whole kind of analysis that as we unpack DNA, as we understand science more, as we understand the human mind more, we see that religion is just a set of fairy tales, a set of fables. And Jonathan Sacks sets out to try to argue that's not the case, and that instead of being seen as contradictory, religion and science are actually complementary. And he argues that Judaism always saw it that way, that Judaism always acknowledged that science and religion occupy different domains. Think about, if you read literature, you read a novel differently than you would read poetry, right? I mean, you look for different things. They're just two different genres of literature. You read a technical, and you would take an instruction manual for a TV, you would read that differently than you read a beautiful work of literature. They're both writing, they're both communication, but they are different genres. We treat them differently. And so the same is true with religion and science. They belong to different areas of expertise, and that we confuse the two because, well, here's what this chapter is really about. This chapter is all about why we confuse the two. So why do we think that religion and science have to abide by the same set of rules? And he starts with this idea of the right brain and the left brain. Now how many of you have heard about the differences between the right brain and the left brain? Who knows the general theory? What is it? Who wants to tell us? Somebody just unmute yourself and tell what do the two do differently? What's the difference between the right brain and left brain?
Well, I'll give it a stab. The left brain is thought to be much more analytical, takes things apart. That's it. Whereas the right hemisphere, the right brain, looks at things in more of a macro view, actually puts things together, synthesizes instead of breaks apart. That's how I understand.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's there's all kinds of new interesting research on this too. They're pretty separate, but they're not as separate as we might think. So Jonathan Sacks, this book is I think this book is about 10 years old. So there's actually been new research since this book was written about the two, but let's just take his suppositions for granted and what Jeff you just described so eloquently. They're generally different ways of looking at the world. Anyone who has multiple kids knows that, we don't see the world the same way. Some kids are really great artists. Some are really, good at math. Our brains operate differently. And what he argues is that so he takes Greek thought and Judaic thought. So Hellenism and Hebraicism, and basically says Hebraicism is more right-brained. Right-brained is about character. It's about values. It's about relationships, covenant, the relationship. It's not a zero-sum thing between God and the Jewish people, between people and each other. So that's a sort of right-brained approach to religion. Greek Hellenistic thought was very left-brained. I mean, where does geometry come from? Euclid, So Greek thought is very left-brained. And Christianity basically adopted mostly Greek thought. So in Greek thought, A cannot equal B. A and B are separate things. Whereas in Judaic thought, right brain thinking, A and B may just be different in different realms of understanding. Artists combine contradictory things all the time, right? I mean, artists, that's the whole way of thinking, is you shatter existing categories, right? That's what great artists ultimately do. There's a lot of different skills in art. Some artists are just technically incredible. Some artists sort of break convention, right? I mean, they what was that famous painting that was sold and then it started to destroy itself a couple of years ago? We may not like that art, but it's interesting, it's creative. So the right brain can hold contradictory things at the same time. And so essentially, Christianity, which was born out of the marriage of Judaism and Hellenism, basically, Sachs argues, is much more left brain. It's Hellenistic. And he argues he points to a few different things. This is chapter 3 mainly, that explain this. First of all, he said Christianity is predominantly Hellenistic because, one, it focuses on universality. So there's a very famous book in Galatians that's part of the New Testament that says neither Christian nor Jew, nor Greek nor Roman, or I think it is Roman, whatever. It says none of these differences matter. We're all one. We're all one in Jesus. And so this is a universality. This is essentially saying that our ethnic differences, our backgrounds don't matter. That is a very Greek idea. Plato, for example. Plato, we all know, you remember there's the table and then there's the perfect form of the table. And that's a universal, the table of all tables that's up in heaven, that's up in the afterlife or wherever. That is a universality. And he argues that it's very left-brained. That is not the right brain ideal. That is not the Jewish ideal. Judaism values particularity, the particular relationship between God and the Jewish people, the particular sanctity of Shabbat. Shabbat is not just like any other day of the week. So whereas Greek thought is Hellenistic, or Greek, that's by definition, Greek thought is universal, Judaism is particular, Christianity generally is more universal. So that's one key difference. The second is dualism. Now, this is very important. In Greek thought and in Christian thought, there is a difference between body and soul, between this world and the next world. Now, we all know that. Remember, in Judaism, we don't talk all that much about the afterlife. Now, there is an idea of the afterlife. Don't get me wrong. It exists, but it's not our emphasis. Our emphasis is on this life. In Christianity, however, there's a strong dualism. There's this life and the afterlife. There's the faith and works, right? That's famous Paul, that salvation by faith alone, that faith is separate from action. The two can be divided cleanly. In Judaism, they can't. Faith and action go hand in hand. That's all one. You can't draw. That's a false separation within traditional Judaism. That's why, by the way, one of the great insights or interesting observations is right in the book of Leviticus, it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then it says, you shall not mix wool and linen in your clothes. And you think to yourself, wait a minute, one of those commandments sounds a little bit more important than the other. But in a traditional Jewish interpretation, they're both commandments from God. One is about what we wear, one is about how we act. They're all part of one commandment. There's no real, it's the right word. There's no real teleological difference. There's no difference in class. Now, we might find one to be more important to ourselves, but from a philosophical basis, the two are both similar. They're both commandments from God. So he says that Christianity took up the more dualistic worldview. That, by the way, explains why today in the Western world, which is deeply shaped by Christianity, we have that dualistic thinking, science and religion. Science and religion. Judaism, those aren't two dueling forces. They're all part of God's creation. This is very important. Third difference, and this doesn't have as much to do with science and religion, but that the Greek view of life was tragic. I mean, you've all seen, everyone has seen Greek tragic plays, right? Oedipus Rex is the classic example. There's nothing he can do. You know, Oedipus's fate is sealed. It is a tragedy. The Greek playwrights excelled in tragedy, right? I mean, that's the Greek genius of theater, was beautiful tragedies. In Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, there's no word for tragedy, because tragedy assumes that something is fated. It is destined to happen. There's nothing you can do about it. In Judaism, there's that isn't an idea. Our fates, you know, God certainly has a role, but our actions matter. And so Christianity took up the Greek idea of tragedy, mainly in the fall. The whole idea of the fall of man, with Eve eating the apple and Adam eating the apple, that we are sinful. We have a sinful nature, that is our fate, and there's nothing we can do to get around it except salvation through Jesus. But that is the tragic condition of humanity. And Sachs argues that Christianity, now this is a whole nother interesting observation. He really says Pauline Christianity. So, you know, basically, one of the things that Sachs says without saying it, which is really interesting, is that Christianity, modern Christianity, is much more the religion of Paul than it is the religion of Jesus, which is an interesting observation. And he doesn't say that outright, but that's the implication of what he's saying, and he wouldn't say that outright, because that is, you know, that's treading into Christian hermeneutics, Christian debate. But Jesus, he points out, Jesus didn't really speak Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic and Hebrew. But the New Testament is written in Greek. And the New Testament is supposed to be the words and teachings of Jesus. So Sachs says you have a religion based on the teachings of somebody in a language that he never spoke. So that's kind of weird. But it is what it is. I'm not here to degrade any other religion. It's just the reality. So really, Paul much more shapes the message of Christianity, which is, you know, I've written about this. I'm certainly not an expert on Paul. I mean, Paul's such an interesting figure. But Jesus, he lived and died as a Jew. He didn't know there was a new religion created around his teachings. That comes with Paul and later. So anyways, what I'm trying to get at is the idea is that there is human beings have a fated tragedy, that human existence is ultimately tragic, and that we need a savior. We need something to redeem us from that tragedy, and that's the role Jesus plays. I already talked about faith and works, and this is sort of another core idea. He says that Greek thought saw the world, or that Christianity adopted a Greek notion of God, even though the Greeks were somewhat polytheistic, that there is the God of Aristotle, the God of philosophy, and then there's the God of Abraham. And one God, the God of Aristotle, is static. That's the deist idea. God sets the world into motion, and then God steps back and lets humanity, you know, do its thing. whereas the God of Abraham is a dynamic God. The God of Abraham is in communication with people. The God of Abraham has emotions, has feelings, is able to redeem the Jewish people. That's the God of Abraham. And he points to the difference in translation of a very famous biblical verse. This is the most famous name of God. It's when Moses is at the burning bush, and God says, Moses says to God, "Who shall I tell the Israelites sent me?" And God says, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh." Now, this is a very odd, this is a very difficult phrase to translate, but the most famous translation is, "I am what I am. Tell them I am what I am sent you." And that's how the Pentateuch, which is or the Septuagint, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Torah, translates it as "I am what I am." But in Hebrew, it really means "I will be what I will be." Big difference. One is the present tense, one is the future tense. Jonathan Sacks wrote a whole nother book called Future Tense, which is all about Judaism. And so a future tense God is dynamic, is changing, is adapting for the future. And he argues that Christianity took up the God of the philosophers, whereas Judaism preserved the God of Abraham. Now, you might be asking, well, if God is the reason Christianity, in a sense, needs Jesus is to humanize God. That because the Christian idea of God is so distant, it's static, God has to come into humanity in human form. That in a sense, Christianity needs a human divine figure in order to bridge the gap between God and the people. Whereas in Judaism, all of us are part human and part divine. Isn't that interesting? Jonathan Sacks makes that in Judaism, he has this line, in Judaism, we are all both human and divine. We're created in the image of God. There's part of God's spark within us. So in a sense, each of us is a Jesus-like person. Now, Jesus, in classical Christianity, Jesus is fully God. Jesus is not human. Now, that's sort of going into Christian theology. But Judaism doesn't need Jesus, in other words. We have Torah, but we also, each of us has elements of God within us. So what does this all mean for the relationship between Judaism and science or religion and science? Well, he says all of these ideas in Christianity, they create a kind of, this dualism means that religion can live in its own world, that religious ideas do not have to conform with broader culture, and that it can kind of it can operate by its own rules and can reject things that don't fit in those rules. And in universality, that is the idea that if I have the truth, it's always true, and I can kill for that truth, and that there can be one truth with a capital T that operates everywhere. So in other words, if I say that the world was created in 7 days, that is a fact, and it's true in scientifically, it's true morally, it's true geologically, it's true everywhere. And so there's this sharp divide. You cannot get around. This is why at certain Christian colleges, professors have to sign a statement saying, we believe that Adam and Eve lived and that the world was created in 7 days. That you cannot, even if every single bit of scientific logic goes against that, because religion is truth with a capital T and is universal and has to apply in every domain of science, you cannot undermine it. So how does Judaism understand the role of science? This is where it gets really interesting. So Sacks argues that because we are predominantly right-brained religion, we can embrace multiple ways of understanding the truth. So I don't know, he doesn't do it in this book, but in other books, he compares Judaism to Cubist art, So if you ever go to the Art Institute and you look at the incredible paintings by Braque and later Picasso, how you see that art depends on where you go into it, your entry point, right? That's part of the beauty of Cubism. It's multidimensional. You see it differently depending on how you look at it. So that's how Torah works. The story of when we read that God created the world in 7 days, we're not reading that. We're not looking at that as scientific fact. We're looking at that as a statement about that the world was created with a sense of order. We're not trying to get science out of that story. We're trying to get morality. We're trying to get meaning. Just like we're trying to, when we read an instruction manual versus when we read a poem, they're both words, they're both documents, but we're looking for something different from that. It's particular, it's right-brained. So it doesn't have to be science. And that is a fundamental, Sachs says, a fundamental kind of confusion in sort of the Christian worldview, and then now predominantly the Western worldview, that sees these two as contradictions rather than complementary. Does that make sense? It's a lot of stuff there, a lot of intellectual stuff. But let questions, and then I'll keep going. Who's got any questions or comments? Just unmute yourself if you do.
Okay, I do.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
In Orthodox Judaism, I mean, some more literal Judaism that take the Torah as written by God's hand, with the finger of God.
Yes.
Wouldn't those more fanatical ends of Judaism take the Torah more literally?
No, that's a very good question, and it is not. Now, there might be some crazies out there, okay? Yes, there probably are some ultra Orthodox Jews who would take that. But in general, I mean, Maimonides was a great scientist. Maimonides, and is considered one of the greatest rabbis of all time. He was as Orthodox as they get, and he doesn't really say it outright, but he essentially says the world wasn't created in 7 days. So this is what you're saying is a very important distinction. In general, there is greater flexibility in interpreting text within Judaism, within Orthodox Judaism, than there is in Christianity. Christianity, the highest level of the textual interpretation is literal. That you have to believe the world's created in 7 days. In Judaism, the literal reading of the text is just one level. There is also the mystical reading of the text. There's the agadic reading of the text. There's the midrashic reading of the text. So there are multiple ways of understanding text. That doesn't mean we don't take them seriously. We take them very seriously, but there is room for interpretation. The idea, this is sort of and this is a hard concept to understand. This is not easy, because the reason it's not easy is that most of us, since we live in the Western world, our worldview is in many ways shaped by Christianity much more than we know. Much more. Like the simple fact that we use the word sin, that's not a Hebrew word. The fact, here, the fact that we all speak English, that's our native language, that shapes the way we think. If we grew up as native Hebrew speakers, we might think differently than the fact that we're native English speakers. The fact that we're native English speakers means that in some ways our categories of thought are shaped by Christianity, even though we're Jewish, or most, if we're on this call, not everybody, but so our whole way of thinking is shaped by our language, by our culture. And so it's hard to understand this idea that in Judaism, in traditional Judaism, there are so many ways of reading a text. And that is that as long as you abide by Jewish law, as long as you are following Jewish norms, you can understand text on many different levels, in some ways that seem totally outrageous, and yet they are within the Jewish canon. Yeah.
the fact that Talmud honors both sides of the discourse, opposing points of view, and writes them both down, that's a very novel intellectual approach in a way to say that both points of view are both opposing points of view can both be important.
Well, that's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that is the, and that is, in other words, what makes somebody orthodox is not that they read the text literally. It's that they follow Jewish law. So you can be an orthodox person and yet be a total believer in evolution. There's no contradiction. There's absolutely no contradiction. And that is an important point. The fact that this gets to the broader point. The fact that we see religion and science as contradictory is much more reflective of a Christian or classical Christian Western worldview than a Judaic worldview. And that's part of the point that Sachs is trying to get across. That's, and that is extremely important. I mean, and I think we see manifestations of that today. I mean, by the way, you might be thinking, well, what about all the Haredi people that didn't take the vaccine and seem to be anti-science? There's a lot of interesting stuff around that. And it's sort of a topic. I mean, but essentially what I would say is that Haredi Judaism today, that's the ultra Orthodox, are not authentically Orthodox. They are much more governed by contemporary, they are much more, in a sense, shaped by Christian fundamentalism than Judaism, because there was never really a fundamentalist Judaism. I mean, think about Sephardic Jews today are much more of the sort of, in Sephardic communities in Israel, they will go to synagogue in the morning and go to a soccer game in the afternoon, and they're Orthodox. And you think, well, that's crazy. They're Orthodox. Of course, they're going to observe all of Shabbat. It was never, Judaism up until really the 19th century, it was never as strict as it is now. I mean, just look, I was talking to somebody, Orthodoxy has gotten much stricter over the past 50 years than liberal. And think about it, in Chicago, I was just talking with one of our members who grew up in Rogers Park, and she grew up going to an Orthodox synagogue. They called it traditional, where it was mixed seating. This was an Orthodox rabbi, and it was mixed seating. But essentially, that is verboten now in Orthodoxy. There is no mixed seating. It is all strict. But until really 30, 40 years ago, there were a lot of modern Orthodox synagogues that had mixed seating. There's nothing in the Talmud that says men and women can't sit together. It's a stricture. It's an additional rigor that's added, mainly because there is a fear of the modern world. There is a fear of the modern world that as the modern world becomes more secular, we have to build our walls even higher. That's a very important point. Okay, other questions or comments?
Rabbi?
Yes.
Marilyn. Hi. I remember last week when Rabbi Sarata was teaching the first two chapters, he emphasized several times that the partnership was that in science, we take things apart to see how they work, and religion puts things together, Rabbi said.
Yes.
He was quoting Rabbi Sachs, to see what they mean.
Yes.
And there's a need for both. It was my understanding after Rabbi finished his lecture last week. So I wanted to tell the class that I found online a wonderful, it's almost cartoon-like, it's a sketching of Rabbi Sachs speaking, and while he's speaking, an illustrator is illustrating the right brain and the left brain. And it's so clear and defined. And so some of these things that you were saying are difficult to understand, are so simply put. So if anybody just click on Rabbi Sachs, the partnership, and you'll see a cartoonish head of Rabbi Sachs. And one of the things that I learned watching that cartoon, it quotes Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein says that science without religion is lame, but religion without science is blind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was an interesting quote by Albert Einstein.
Well, it is. It is very interesting. And essentially, what the most recent research about right brain and left brain suggests is that they're really not as separate as we make them out to be, that they cannot really exist without the other. And there's all kinds of interesting scientific studies. There's a great book about this. I read it a while ago and it was very complex. I can't even remember what it's called. What's it? It's by a neuroscientist at Berkeley, and it's got Descartes in the title. I'll find it for next time. But what he argues is even the logical parts of the left brain, they don't function properly without the right brain. And so the two, they are separate, but they also rely on each other. And so in some ways, that's the same difference between science and religion. You know, in order to have a flourishing life, we need both science and religion. Because imagine if we lived in a totally religious world, like a theocracy, that would be pretty bad. I mean, one could argue that North Korea is essentially a theocratic state, except it's the theocracy of Kim Jong-il, of that family. And so essentially it's a religious state and the religion is worship of this family. Whereas a totally secular state where there is no sense of meaning or purpose, that wouldn't be so good either. Where, imagine if there's no concept of forgiveness and so forth. So you need both. You need both. And this is very important. Okay, other comments? Okay, now I'm going to get to the fourth. So what I just sort of covered is chapter 3. And by the way, one of the overriding metaphors that Sachs uses all the time is that religions are like languages. They're like languages. And we wouldn't say that English and French contradict one another. They don't. They're just different. They're different ways of expressing ideas. And there are very important differences. There are different ideas that you can express in French than you could in English. And the way we interpret ideas in French, hearing certain French words have connotations that you can't capture in English and vice versa. There are different nuances to the language. And so it is with religions. They're a sense like languages. They're different. They point towards the same thing. They're both about communication, but they do so in different ways. And so that is a really good metaphor for understanding. And our ways of thinking are shaped by our language, just like our ways of thinking are shaped by our religion. Okay, so we get to chapter 4, Finding God. Now, a lot of this is about Sachs's own journey. And what he essentially goes up against here is he is arguing against the whole group of people who say, well, I can't see God, I can't prove God, so therefore God doesn't exist. This, and it's sort of simple atheism. And he's saying, that's not a very sophisticated put down of religion. And that's called the ontological argument. So essentially, he begins by saying the kind of God that is assumed by philosophers who are atheists, that's not the kind of God that Judaism upholds. That's the kind of God that philosophers uphold. That a God that is fundamentalist is not the Jewish kind of God. The Jewish God we know the famous scene where Abraham argues with God in Sodom and Gomorrah. That Abraham has this whole conversation with God. That's not a static God. That's a dynamic God. So Sachs says these classical refutations for God, they're not addressing the right question. I love this quote here, by the way. Wittgenstein, who's sort of one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, said he called philosophy the battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. So Wittgenstein saw philosophy as clarifying ideas, and that's essentially what Sachs is doing. Is he's operating at a Jewish philosopher, trying to clarify what do Jews really believe about God and why that doesn't fit the way people caricature God. Okay. Okay, let's keep going here. He talks a little bit about miracles. Now, this is another very interesting concept. So when we think about miracles, we think primarily about violation of the supernatural order. That a miracle is God doing something totally unnecessary. That, there's a famous scene in Exodus where Moses dips his staff in water and a snake appears. That is a way of refuting, or it's a way of showing that God is greater than the Egyptian gods. But here, Sachs essentially quotes Maimonides, who's saying, Maimonides argued that miracles are not proof of anything, since there is always the possibility that they have been performed by magic, optical illusion, or the like. The Israelites did not believe in Moses because of the miracles he performs. This is what Maimonides said. Why then did Moses perform them? Because they answered a physical, not a metaphysical need. Why did he divide this Red Sea? Because the Israelites needed to get to the other side. Why did he produce manna from heaven and water from a rock? Because the people were hungry and thirsty. Believe in miracles, said Maimonides, and there is a danger you will believe in false prophets. So essentially, Maimonides is saying that this whole idea of how we think about miracles is wrong. Miracles have a pragmatic, or what the Torah understands as miracles, have a very pragmatic purpose. And yet, people who try to undermine religion, undermine God, they look at miracles as evidence of religion's stupidness. That how can you believe in a God that would split the Red Sea? He said, actually, how Sachs would answer is, actually, the purpose of the Red Sea is not to illustrate God's power. The purpose of the Red Sea is that they needed to get to freedom. It doesn't really matter how it came about. It came about because the Israelites needed to cross. That's the story. It's not about proving how great God is. That's not the purpose of the miracles. That's not the purpose of the plague. Okay. Yeah, and Sachs continues this theme. Okay. Yeah, this is great. Abaya, so I'm on page 81. Abaya, who's a great rabbi of the first century, believed that we should not need miracles, nor should we rely on them. Judaism is a religion that celebrates law, the natural law that governs the physical universe, and the moral law that governs the human universe. God is found in order, not in the miraculous suspension of that order. If you read closely the book of Exodus, the book that contains the most and greatest miracles, you will see that none induce lasting faithfulness on the part of the Israelites. Within 3 days of the division of the Red Sea, they were complaining about the water. 41 days after the revelation at Mount Sinai, they were making a golden calf. Faith is about seeing the miraculous in the everyday, not about waiting every day for the miraculous. That's a beautiful quote right there. Beautiful quote. So he's saying that the way we understand religion doesn't depend on miracles. Our whole approach to religion is not about believing something that is outrageous. You can be a good Jew, a faithful Jew, and you could basically say, I don't think the story of Abraham and Sarah is literally true. I don't, it's not I don't believe it's true, and yet I believe it's powerful. So this is very important. Questions about this? Agree, disagree? Yes, Sarah, go ahead.
Well, I think things can have a metaphorical truth without having a literal truth, in terms of having a message for us that is useful. I'm a scientist. I spent all my years in science research, and I would say that science view of miracles might be a very low probability event. occurring, a very, very low probability event occurring.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Other comments? All right, good. Let me keep going here. Okay. So Sachs is essentially saying the religion of Judaism isn't a religion that needs miracles. And yet, part of the job of a religious person is to uncover the order God built into the universe. What he argues is that the Genesis story of God creating the world in 7 days, it's actually very scientific, not anti-scientific. It's scientific because it shows how creation unfolds in an order, that there is an underlying order to the universe. And part of the job of a scientist is to uncover that order as best we can. Now, one could argue that the order is so chaotic that there is no order, in which case we just have to dig further and find more order. You know, that's part of the challenge of science, and that, you know, there's a lot of new science that says there is an emergent order that, you know, and this is getting into a lot of modern physics and the way that creation, in a sense, self-orders, that in very complex phenomena, you actually see you actually see things generating order spontaneously. And part of what science does is uncover that. And what Sachs would say is that's all part of God's creation. God created the world with an order, and that's what the 7 days of creation is about. It's not literally about 7 days. Okay. Okay, let's keep going here. Yeah, and then he talks about Bernard Williams, who, yeah, is one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. And Bernard Williams wrote an article against irrationalism in religion. And there's a famous quote from the Christian, I think he was a church father named Tertullian, that said, "I believe because it is impossible." So this was talking about the virgin birth. "I believe it is true because it is absurd, because it is impossible." That the definition of God is one who does impossible things. And Sachs and Sachs agrees that that type of religion is extremely dangerous. Extremely. I mean, think about all the cults that said the end of the world is coming, and you knew that it's totally impossible, and yet people believed because it was impossible. If you embrace that type of worldview, that you can have certainty in something that is irrational, you're on the way to a very dangerous religion. Whereas Sachs says that was never the approach of Judaism. The approach of Judaism was always that we can uncover the reason that everything, ultimately, Sachs cites Maimonides, that everything within Jewish law has to have some purpose to improve the human condition. That all the mitzvot, even those where we might not totally understand why they exist, there is a good reason they exist, and that reason is to refine our character. And Maimonides, part of his goal was to understand the purpose of all the commandments. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Then Sachs goes on and he talks again about the different approaches of the Jewish view of God and the Greek view of God, the static God and the dynamic God. And then he goes to the question of what is the function of religion? And this goes to that point where I kind of started at the beginning, is that we read prose and poetry differently. They each have a different objective. When we read let's say we read a nonfiction and a fiction book differently, right? If you pick up a book of nonfiction, you may want to learn something about, you know, what happened in this era. But if you pick up a novel, you may just want to be entertained and engaged in characters and big ideas. They're different genres of literature. So he argues that religion and science are different genres of truth. So so to go back to Sachs's personal story, he argues that when he started to study philosophy, he was looking for reflections on the human condition. But what he found is that philosophy had become all about language. And so he turned to religion as a quest for meaning. He said, slowly it began to dawn on me that I would have to turn to religion, not philosophy, to find the wisdom I sought. Philosophy aimed at universality, at propositions that were true in all places at all times, but meaning is expressed in particularity. There is no universal meaning. And he uses this great joke that says, imagine if you go into a restaurant and you say, I want to order soup. They say, okay, we got minestrone, chicken noodle, borscht. You say, no, I want soup. Say, that doesn't make any sense. There is soup, but there are particular kinds of soup, and that's what you want to eat. And the idea of that joke was that if you want to live as human beings, there are certain particular decisions. Like if you believe in the idea of marriage, you cannot just say, I am married to the world. You are married to a particular person. There is a particular, just like you eat a particular soup, there's a particular person with whom you establish a marital relationship. And so that meaning in life comes from particular commitments, and that's okay. You know, it is okay if you love your children more than you love my children, or you love the children of your neighbor. That's good. That's how it's supposed to be. We have particular relationships with whom we have responsibilities. It is good if you, it's good if we care more about certain Jewish issues, if you're Jewish, than we care about other issues. That's okay. You know, that particular commitments matter. I mean, lawyer, if you're an attorney, you have an obligation to your particular client. Yes, you serve the bar. Yes, you serve justice, but you also serve a particular client. And that is where your responsibilities are. And in terms of life, we have particular relationships, and that's where our responsibilities are. And that's where we derive the greatest meaning. So he essentially says Judaism has understood this and has sort of stood against universalism. Okay. Then he does some, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. About mitzvot. Aren't there certain mitzvot that are in Torah that we don't understand at all? There's a certain level of mitzvot that we have to obey, even if we don't understand what it is. We just have to say, okay, if God said it, we have to do it. And we don't know what in the world it means, but we still have to do it.
Okay. Mom, you're getting at a very important question. And this was a major difference between Maimonides and Soloveitchik. So Maimonides said, yes, there is a good reason for every commandment. We may not understand the reason, but there is a reason. And we have to have faith in our rabbis, in our leaders, and ultimately in God, that there is a reason we may not totally understand. But with the right learning, we will ultimately understand. Maimonides believed that we will ultimately understand, and we will understand it pragmatically. And part of his quest was understanding. Soloveitchik said, actually, there are certain things in religion that are just simply mysterious, that we will never understand. Maimonides would never accept that. Maimonides would say, well, then you're just going down the path of superstition. If you say that there are certain things you just can never understand and you have to do it, that's a very dangerous path to go down. So in other words, there are different arguments within the Jewish tradition. I would say Sachs is closer to Maimonides. Sachs would say, there are reasons for all the commandments. And the fact that we don't know them all yet is simply the limits of human knowledge and time. We'll ultimately understand them, that God wouldn't ask us to do something that didn't make sense. Okay, great question. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
So are you talking about the 613 commandments, or you're talking about the 10? Okay. So the mother and the baby birds is a problematic one in Deuteronomy.
That you're not supposed to kill
You're supposed to shoo away the mother before you
Right.
take the baby, you take the eggs or something like that.
Yeah. Well, that's just because, I mean, that's one could argue that that's humanistic, that it violates the mother's nature to watch her children killed. And that, we shouldn't, and also that biologically, that a mother should be able to reproduce again. So, Sachs, and there are many Orthodox rabbis who have written volumes on the commandments. Now, my personal view of this is that there are certain commandments that don't make any sense. Maimonides believed that some of the commandments about kashrut had health reasons. And there's really, that I think sometimes certain customs become commandments that were just customs. And then, it's like anything in life, something becomes a habit and you just do it. And there wasn't any real good reason for it. And you could just as well, not do it. So I happen to disagree. I think that there are certain commandments that really have no reason other than that was maybe a superstition. Think about it. Why don't Jews eat pork? Okay, you could argue pigs are dirty animals. Well, so what? You can still eat it. There's nothing unhealthy. There's nothing wrong with that. People eat pork all the time and are fine. The whole idea that it gives you trichinosis, that's sort of been disproven. So it may have just been a superstition. Jews didn't like pigs. Okay, so we don't eat it, but it doesn't have a deeply moral reason for it. Could be a sociological reason. Okay. Other questions or concerns? Great. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, now he goes into essentially, now this is really good stuff. He said, we need science and religion to exist in separate realms, because if we totally believe in science, if our religion is science, remember how I mentioned at the beginning in passing that one of the people that wrote the book, the God Delusion, Richard Dawkins, is a pedophile. He's been credibly charged. Well, okay, so that not that I don't want to disparage one person, but the idea is that there is an amorality to science if it's purely science. There were Nazis who were extremely educated. Heidegger, probably considered the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Martin Heidegger. I had to read a book of his in one of my classes in college, and I didn't understand a word of it, but it was interesting. But he was considered the greatest philosopher, and he was a total Nazi, and he never apologized. Never. He when people asked him about it afterwards, he just evaded the question. And so in Germany, the same country that 90% of the population supported Hitler, was also the country of great universities, of Beethoven, of Bach. If our worldview is purely, cause effect without a moral sense, we're in deep danger. We are in deep, deep danger. Not that, and again, that's not to say, this is not to say that all people who are atheists are amoral. That's not, individuals are different than a culture, that or different than ideologies in abstract. There can be atheists or people who who reject God totally, who are totally good moral people, and there can be people who are very religious who are terrible people. There's always those exceptions. But in general, if a society doesn't have room for both, that society is dangerous. I think that's one of the things Sachs is getting at. Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
I think science is amoral.
Mm-hmm.
Morality is not the domain of science.
Yes, that's right.
And science then can be applied. And it's in the application of science where ethics of science comes in. And there was an interesting news flash this week that Israel has invented a uterus, an artificial uterus. And
Yeah.
they've now grown mice for half the gestation period in this artificial uterus, which if they succeed in this research, you can create an animal in a test tube and grow it to life, and birth without a mother.
Very interesting.
Now this has potential wonderful applications, but it also has extremely scary applications in terms of, creating slave race, or,
Oh,
you can think about all kinds of things. So I think there's many things in science, in the application of science, where you have to turn to ethics and morality to know how to apply it.
oh, these are huge questions. In fact, Walter Isaacson, who wrote the biographies of Benjamin Franklin and Steve Jobs, he just came out with a biography of the founder of CRISPR, which is this human genome editing. Essentially, it's assuming it continues to develop, you can find out ahead of time whether your child may be a danger for MS, for all kinds of illnesses, and then you can edit genes early. Now, this creates huge moral questions. One could say, well, you could say children who are deaf or who may have MS say, well, that's who I am. That's my identity. I don't want that edited out. I wouldn't, this is who I am. I mean, there are people who say that shaped them. And one could argue that we as human beings are made more empathetic by living with people with disabilities. On the other hand, who are we to say? I mean, if you can use medicine to help improve human life, why not use it? These are big questions, and there's no simple answers. Anyone who gives a really simple answer, I would question. Someone who doesn't acknowledge that these are complex issues is really treading on dangerous ground. And I think you're right. I think it's going to get more and more complex and difficult and hard to unpack, and potentially very dangerous. I mean, there's a lot of people, artificial intelligence, there are a lot of people that are afraid that ultimately computers can become smarter than human beings. I mean, they already are. I mean, there was the famous when the IBM supercomputer beat Garry Kasparov in chess. I mean, that this computer and computers are. I mean, if you've ever seen the Terminator movies, I mean, this was, they're kind of pedestrian movies, but the idea was that computers ultimately become stronger than human beings and destroy humanity. I mean, this is so, and there are a lot of really smart researchers that are afraid of this possibility. And so you need kind of ethical guidelines. Other questions, concerns? Yeah, Rabbi Ike?
I just want to talk a little bit on that idea that science is amoral. Just in the sense that, I mean, maybe this is more of a historical, but, the rationalists, the founders of Reform Judaism, the idea that, rationalism in education was really how they understood it, and somebody like Immanuel Kant or someone like that is talking about how reason leads us to goodness. And so when Sachs brings the argument about Heidegger into the picture, it's clear that education, intelligence, and knowing things doesn't necessarily lead to goodness. So science may be amoral, but it's no inoculation, right? So, and that's why we need both.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that I learned from Sachs. When people say religion is the cause of all violence and murder and terrible things in the world, you say, okay, what were the two most murderous regimes of the 20th century? Hitler and Stalin, and could add Mao in too. Were any of those three religious? No. I mean, Nazi Germany was, nominally Protestant, but it was a split off of the Protestant church, and it was, the German state took over the church. And whereas Stalin and Mao were explicitly anti-religious. So religion isn't the cause of all violence. That's a whole nother separate topic. Okay, Meredith, and then we have to conclude.
In his last book, Jonathan Sachs really develops the difference that the separation of subjectivity and objectivity has to do with the development of morality. And he really concludes that morality then has to be defined and refined within community. Mm-hmm. And so when you then go backwards and look at his earlier works, you see in many ways how community seems to be the bedrock from which these thought processes develop. And community in religion and community in science are formed very differently.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Thank you, Mary. That's exactly right. And that's what I was trying to get at when I was saying, you can love your kids more than you love my kids, and you can treat like, if you had to go, fly somewhere across the country to be with the child during surgery, you might do that for your kids. You might not do it for another person's kids. And that's good. That's fine. That's the way that we have particular commitments, and particular communities can have particular, as a synagogue, if somebody dies who's a member of the synagogue and that person, they're part of your community, you may do more for them than you would for someone who dies halfway across the world. That's just our that's how we're created. We're created for particular relationships. And so just like we're created to speak particular languages. And so Sachs exactly right, trying to locate morality in the particular communities. Now, that doesn't mean that we do have certain responsibilities to all of humanity. You can't murder, you can't steal. We do have certain commitments and responsibilities, but we also have more commitments and responsibilities to those closest to us. Okay, until next week, I wish all of you a wonderful week and great discussion, and I hope you're getting a lot out of this book. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Beyond me.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good week. and a
Good
day.
Passover, everyone.
Yeah.
Happy Passover.
True.